Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. Here is Munir Al-Azouzi from easymedicaldevice.com. And today we will not talk about MDR because I think we have talked enough about MDR, but we will go through IVDR this time. And for that, I have with me Eric Volbrecht from Axon Lawyers, who will help us to understand more about the self-testing in terms of IVDR. So Eric, welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast.
Thanks for having me again, Munir. And yeah, MDR is boring. We've discussed it too much, I think. We should definitely do some more IVDs.
Yeah, I think it's the right time because companies really have to understand that if they already have not moved to IVDR or think about IVDR or having a strategy, it's maybe a bit too late for them. We have still, as of now, I think, if I remember, 3 or 4 notified bodies for IVDR. With one which is BSI UK, which will not be anymore notified body as of 26th of May 2021. But yeah, then I think there is really more things that we have to do here in terms of IVDR. And today we'll talk about self-testing, in vitro diagnostic that you are using as self-test.
Yes.
Okay, so Eric, regarding that, so maybe just to introduce this topic, what is really a self-test device? And you mentioned also near-patient device. So what is exactly that?
Yeah, so self-testing, it's a newly defined term in the IVDR. We already had self-tests, of course, because they're literally mentioned in the IVD directive. But the IVDR now defines them for the first time. And basically, self-test in the definition of the IVDR is what it was for most people under the IVDD as well. And that's an IVD test that can be used is intended to be used by laypersons. So that means that a layperson can completely use the test themselves, so both for the sampling and for interpretation of the result. And this is really where there's, of course, a big difference between professional use tests and self-tests, because often these professional use tests are they are much less binary in the results. For example, they will give you a range and then some intolerances, and then you'll have to figure out. But for lay persons, yeah, they basically have to, you have kids, I have kids. Of course, we've both been through the super exciting times when your wife disappears in the toilet with the pregnancy test and then goes out, and then you sit there and you wait, and well, that's your typical self-test testing. Yeah.
So mainly we have this existing in our life, so it's not something new that is existing. So we have some products that are already used. You can get that, as you mentioned, in a pharmacy. So to use that yourself, and as you mentioned, maybe the issue or the thing that is difficult here is the fact that we are not professional people. So by using them, we can misinterpret or misuse or have some different issues. So it's why maybe this has there is a particular care on the regulation or on the directive about those type of tests. Here we have self-test.
That's also where the directive is quite vague, because the directive basically just says, hey, if you have a self-test, you need a design examination by the notified body, Annex 3.6. Whereas the IVDR is much, much, much more prescriptive in all the things that you need to do for a self-test, and especially, as you say, the diligence on the part of the manufacturer to make sure that the test is labeled in a way, and also the IFU is set up in a way that laypersons can actually understand it. But we'll talk about that later, I think. But also, very important, understand when the test has not functioned correctly, for example.
Yeah. So in terms of that, we have self-test and near-patient test. So what is the difference here?
Yeah, the difference is that a near-patient test is a test that is also used close to the patient, just like a self-test. But the test is not intended to be used for the interpretation by the patient or a layperson. So a very nice example of a near patient test is you maybe have seen that Roche and Abbott, for example, are developing these rapid tests for COVID-19.
Yeah.
And they're basically a sort of oversized shoebox size device that you can stick a sample in, and it gives you a result in less than 15 minutes. And these are testing devices that you can distribute throughout the hospital, for example. So theoretically speaking, a layperson can use a test like that themselves, but that's not what they're intended for.
Okay, so we see here also that there is differences between IVDD and IVDR. So there is more requirements now with IVDR when we are talking about self-test, and there is a lot of clarity in terms of those products, where before with the IVDD it was not so clear.
Yeah, I wouldn't always say clarity, but a lot more detail. Let's put it like that.
Now that we have a better understanding of what is a self-test or near patient test, with the IVDR, what is the classification type for this type of product? So with the IVDR now we have a new way to classify products. Before it was list 1, list 2, and all the rest. Now it's class A, class B, class C, class D, with the class A that is low risk and class D that is high risk. So how are we classifying those type of products within the new IVDR?
Well, for self-tests, it's actually it's easy and difficult at the same time, because the IVDR has helpfully included self-tests in class C as a default.
Okay.
So if you have a self-test, you always, basically you are in class C unless something else is the matter. And that could be, for example, when you have a self-test that is intended for an indication in class D, let's say rare blood typing, for example. Because then you have the implementing rule in the classification annex that says if several classification rules apply, then you have to go with the highest risk class.
So in terms of classification, this is the same as for the MDR. If you are class A, it's self-certified, but if you are B, C, D, you have to go through a notified body in that case. So notified bodies will have, for all self-tests, to really review what manufacturers are doing. Yeah.
It's in that sense, it's really not different than under the IVDD, because there also you always have to go to a notified body for your self-test. Except that the review under and also even the logic of the review is the same, because the IVDR also says that you need a design dossier examination by a notified body. But there are a lot of additional prescriptive little requirements on what the label should look like, and also quite a lot on usability and design and so on. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, so mainly what we said before, the fact that we have self-test is used by a layperson. So the biggest risk is the fact that the person misinterprets the information or is not performing correctly. So it's a false positive or a negative, etc. So the idea here is then to promote usability tests. So to have really some usability tests available that will show that your product is correct and that anybody can understand it. So is this something that notified bodies will look carefully now?
Yeah, they definitely, because it's quite prescriptive in Annex 1 with the requirements set out there that you need to design for that. So, for example, I'm just peeking in the presentation that I will give you to reference in the show notes. That you need performance that you need to design specifically for the conditions under which a layperson will be testing, for example. So let's say, for example, I have an IVD that needs a particular that needs very low humidity in order to function reliably. Then that is not something that a notified body would say, yeah, of course you can give this to laypersons as a self-test, because you cannot expect a layperson to have a lower than average for people's homes humidity level in the place where they will test, for example. And of course, and usability as well. That's also an important one. Like, for example, there is a really interesting one that I mentioned at the beginning, a specific requirement for self-testing. So Annex 9 contains a GSPR 19, which is completely new for self-testing devices. And that says, for example, you have to design it in a way and manufacture it in a way that the device produces easy to interpret and non-misleading information.
Yeah.
Well, the only way to meet a GSPR like that is to put a usability study or at least a usability report that you've actually tested this on patients. Like, if they do this, do they actually understand what the result is?
It's a dilemma that we had, for example, for as you said, the pregnancy test or any test where you have those bars that appears. Yeah. Does it mean it's positive? Does it mean it's negative? What does it mean exactly? So you have to read 10 times the document to say, I don't know at the end because it's not clear. So this is mainly
very stressful. I remember you're just like, these letters are too small.
Exactly.
And there's another nice requirement there that you also have to design in a way that that usability design reduces user error.
Okay.
So, for example, your wife runs to the toilet and she's totally nervous about doing this pregnancy test, and then you should basically then have usability design that makes sure that she can actually easily pee on the test, because otherwise you might not get enough urine sample on the test and stuff like that. These are all things you have to design for explicitly now.
So now notified bodies will look specifically at that. Is there a specific standard that they have to follow for making those usability tests?
Well, there's a usability design standard, of course. That's the 62366 standard. That's already harmonized under the IVDD as well. But I'm not sure actually if there is a specific self-test standard for IVDs. I haven't seen that in the harmonization.
Yeah, because the 62366 is the same as we are using also for MDR, so the same thing. So I suppose it's a general one that everybody is using specifically for that. Okay, so in terms of that, so I think it's clear now. We know that what is important is that the person that is using that has to be really understanding what they have to do and to interpret the result of it. So what are then maybe some additional requirements we have for this type of devices in terms of advertisement, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, advertising, that's quite an interesting one, because we've got, well, first of all, we have some labeling requirements, but that's not really super interesting. But we can talk about some. But of course, your advertising can't be contrary to your label. And we have Article 7 now in the IVDR. That's also a provision we have in the MDR that is very explicit about that you can't mislead patients or end users in any way about the performance of the device or what you can measure with it, or even, for example, how quickly it produces a result. So let's say, for example, I have a pregnancy test, and the result can never be produced too quickly in the expectation of people that use the test. So let's say, for example, I have a new pregnancy test and I am going to advertise it as, for example, quickest pregnancy test in the market, for example. Then actually, this is something that could run afoul of Article 7. Because it might be misleading as to the performance, especially if there are other tests in the market that are quicker. Or let's say if I would do something like And that's a bit more of a borderline case. I would say this pregnancy test produces results in minutes, and then it takes the test 20 minutes to produce a result on average. Then you really start to go into the area where the intended purpose, as you advertise it, is not completely in line with how the test functions. And under the IVDD, we were used to dealing with national advertising law that you could use in cases like this. But Article 7 is something that also notified bodies can actually write you up for. And that's an interesting one, because manufacturers really have to do a lot more to make sure that the claims that they advertise are completely consistent with all the underlying documentation all the way back into the performance evaluation report. That's new, actually.
So I think it's really, I mean, it's important to understand that when you are advertising to professionals or to layperson can be really different, because for professional you are using some terms that they understand, so that they really understand where you are going. For layperson, as you said, quickest or more performance or the best or whatever, etc., is some terms that it's more a marketing term, but it's not really providing any clarity in terms of the usage. I imagine if some things, if some tests are saying you'll get the result in 1 minute, but at the end it's coming in 20 minutes. If you make the pregnancy test in 1 minute, you look and you find nothing, you say, okay, I'm not pregnant, but it appears maybe 20 minutes later that you are pregnant. So it's like, what's happening here?
This is a really good example, because under the IVDR, when Article 7 applies, your notified body can just suspend your certificate for a claim like that. And that is, of course, that is kind of crazy. Yeah? That's not something that manufacturers are used to, because what notified bodies would do in these times under the directives, they may look at your marketing for their audit plan, for example, and then decide, okay, they have this new gadget that they're marketing very prominently. Let's see if that all checks out in the technical documentation. But with this, I mean, you really have a lot more skin in the game in terms of marketing, because not only can your notified body write you up for basically infringement of Article 7, but even a competent authority in a member state can say, hey guys, you are misrepresenting the intended purpose as supported by your documentation. Take this device off the market. And that is something that theoretically they could do already at the moment. But now we have an additional legal basis that makes it a lot easier also for competent authorities to intervene and for your competitors to complain about you.
Yeah.
And there will be even member states in which your competitor might have direct standing in court by relying on Article 7 to get your device taken off of the market because you are infringing Article 7. And that's bad news, of course.
So yeah, I think this is why it's really important to tackle this element and to discuss about that, so that people understand that this can happen.
Educate your marketing people.
Yeah. I think the most important thing here is to educate marketing people. I had experience for that, because as a regulator, I was also trying to discuss with some marketing people, and they are really creative sometimes. So it's important to educate them and to tell them that they cannot say things like that or whatever. But in terms of the IFU or so instruction for use, there is also, in comparison to medical devices, there is for IVD some elements that you have to provide there. And I had made this experience when I had helped some customers about their COVID-19 tests. The elements are more about specificity, sensibility of your test, etc. So you have to provide some kind of percentage of false positive that can happen or false negative that can happen. So this is something that is important also to mention to the public, to say, there can be some false positive or false negative tests, and here is the average or the test that we have done. Here is how much we did find during our test.
Exactly. And you also have to explain it to them in a way that becomes meaningful.
Yeah.
So, for example, that they actually understand. I mean, stupid anecdote, but I mean, in Holland, with all the COVID-19 craze going on, we had actually the whole class of my daughter was kept at home for a couple of days because the parents of one of the children had misinterpreted the results of a COVID test.
Okay.
Because they had gotten back negative results. So they thought, oh shit, this is bad news. I mean, of course, for us, it's like, how can you be so stupid? But this is what you're dealing with laypersons.
So it's something that can be really, as you said, so creating misinterpretation, creating some consequences at the end for others. And it's why you have really to be clear in terms of the labeling, the IFU, the advertisement. I had also an issue in terms of the labeling with the fact that some companies want those products, those COVID-19 products, for example, to be distributed to layperson, but they are mentioning for professionals on it. So just to avoid to have a notified body. So this is also some things that are happening to say, I will try to be compliant and to put in for professionals so that I don't need a notified body when they're IVDD. But at the end, their intention is to sell that to a layperson. So what is the risk on doing that?
Well, that's, of course, I would say ethically wrong on many levels and incredibly opportunistic. I've seen it too, especially with the more commercially inclined parties. Well, for example, it would be a clear violation of Article 7. So that's under the IVDR. So that's very clear because you are selling a professional use test as a layperson self-test, which is completely misinterpreting the regulatory status. So that's one. Also, if you sell it as a layperson test, then under the IVDR, you would probably have neglected to label it for all the self-testing requirements. So it's really easy to take it off the market as soon as anybody finds that out. Of course, these are often hit and run actions, right? I've had a lot of cases with commercial parties like distributors that bought like half a ship of Chinese COVID tests and were then going to sell them to consumers. And they were asking me like, is that possible? Yeah, I mean, no.
Yeah.
Actually, in Holland, the healthcare inspectorate put in the beginning of the COVID crisis, they put up a special website and they said, if anybody claims that they have a CE certified self-test for COVID-19, they are lying because nobody is aware of any notified body having given any CE certificate for a self-test for COVID. They just don't exist at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important also to understand that to the public, that this is some hints for you also to understand if the product that you are receiving is really compliant or not. If it's marked for professional, but they give that to a layperson, then it's non-compliant. So that you should not use that because maybe the result that you'll get from it is wrong, and you will misinterpret that. So it's really important that you understand that. In terms of,
and sometimes another important point to make there is that sometimes for professional use tests, if you're in a specific tolerance of the test result, you need to do a confirmatory test,
exactly.
For example, which is something that laypersons will never do unless you tell them very specifically, or you actually build a device which will not show the end result until you have done 2 consecutive sample tests with the same device, for example. That's how you should make a layperson test like that. But that's of course not how these tests work, because they're just like a little thing with some wells, and if you're lucky, it will have some pipetting stuff in there. But I've seen some crazy stuff, I can tell you.
Yeah, no, I've seen that also. And you're right. Usually on the IFU, we are saying that if it's positive, you still have to go through a PCR test to confirm that, and not just rely on this element. As we mentioned, and let's take maybe the COVID-19 test now, there is a lot of those products that are now on the field because everybody's using that to verify that that they are infected or not. How we are doing a post-marketing performance follow-up or something like that about this type of product? So if it's used by a lay person, so can we how can we get those data, if I can say, to say my product is still safe, is still performing correctly, is still doing that? So how we are doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, as we've seen with the MDR is much more prescriptive on post-market clinical follow-up. That's something that a lot of companies have found out the hard way, that you really need to show that you have a life cycle appropriate plan to source data from your economic operators in the market and your end users. And other relevant parties, if you can define them. And for IVDs, for IVDR and self-tests, it's now different. So for a self-test, what you should do if you want to do good post-market performance evaluation is to define which economic operators are in my supply chain for this. So let's say, for example, you sell through drugstores, for example. This would be in the Netherlands would be the place where you would buy your pregnancy test, for example. So you would need to be, and that's where people will also go to complain, like this test is not working, for example. Still not pregnant. How is that possible? But also, for example, you should consider with self-tests for pregnancy, for example, consider general practitioners, because that's also where people will go if they and it might be that they are consistently misinterpreting their tests, or it might be that they go there when they turn out to be pregnant, even though their self-test said they were not. So that's also a place to think about, for example. And then there's the people themselves, which will probably be discussing how their test was on quite a lot of
forums or
Facebook, other social media, but also typically, of course, the women's magazines, discussion fora, and things like that. And that's typically how far you should go as a manufacturer, and just go there and look if anything regularly, if they're saying anything about your test.
No, I think it's a good one, because when we are talking about professional products, if we are delivering that to hospitals or professional people, it's more difficult to get those data from the social media or from people that are contacting you. But here in that case, when it's something that is directly distributed to a layperson, it's easy. You can easily find a group specifically about your product, or people that are complaining. I mean, when your product is not working, they are complaining to 4 or 5 people. When it's working correctly, nobody is complaining and nobody is talking about that. So sometimes, so it's also the way that you have to see that more, if it's bad, you will hear about it. But if it's good, you'll hear maybe about it, but less than if it was bad. But so on the PMPF, so post-marketing performance follow-up, so then you have to set up those sources for picking the information, to say, I will check here, I will check there, I will check that, so to gather all those information, I suppose.
Yeah, that's all part of your big post-market surveillance plan that that you have to do based on the IVDR, and then the IVDR says, just like the MDR, you have to set up a system for post-market surveillance. The system for post-market surveillance contains a post-market surveillance plan, and a post-market surveillance plan. For that, you have to complete Annex 3, the Annex on technical documentation on post-market surveillance, and the post-market surveillance follow-up.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear. So we have a lot of similarities here with the MDR, which is good, because then we don't have to learn different ways to do it. So it's the same kind of way to do it for MDR and IVDR, which is great.
Yeah, that's an important one, I think, for IVD companies that are preparing for the IVDR. That these are all wheels that are, as you say, they are basically identical to the MDR. These are all have been incredibly detailed discussions have been had about this under the MDR. So there's a lot of knowledge already lying around. So they should really not invent the wheel, but rather talk to device manufacturers. And if, for example, a trade association like MedTech Europe, I mean that they unite actually IVDs and medical devices. So that's an easy bridge there. But even on a national level, companies should really not just look within their own little IVD trade association, but also see if they can cross over to the medical devices companies who have done all this homework already and can tell them, because that's what the notified bodies will be doing as well. If you have notified, basically all of them will be both MDR and IVDR notified. So that means that, of course, they're going to use all this information, all the experience from the MDR in the IVDR here, which means also, and that's an important one, is that for IVDR, for IVD companies, let's say the starting threshold, the starting bar is higher than for MDR companies almost in the beginning, when notified bodies were still inventing the wheel themselves.
Yeah.
In the IVDR market, they will come equipped with a completely new and already quite far developed set of wheels.
So yeah, I think it's an important point here, and it's also remaining the speech that we are saying is mainly that start now to look at your process, start now to try to move forward with this IVDR. Don't wait. There is a lot of things that should be performed, and the move from MDD to MDR is smaller than the move from IVDD to IVDR, where you have more to do. So don't think that it's kind of the same work you have to do. It's a completely switch. You have completely to switch on your head or on your processes how you were doing IVDD, because IVDR is completely different. So you have to move forward to this.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, so great. I think we have covered all the elements that we wanted to talk about for the self-testing. I think, as you said, we'll try also to have more discussion about IVDR elements and provide more educative videos about that and a more educative podcast. So is there any last thing that you want to say mainly about maybe self-testing or IVDR specifically?
I think it's sort of adding on to what you've just said. Start now, because of course a lot of companies will probably be hearing this like, Monier, you make money by selling us consultancy with this field. So of course we need to start now, and probably with you as well. No, but really it's not exaggerated, because what I've done with the MDR was tell people, count back from the date of application, so you know when what needs to happen. The transitional regime is such that for an IVD, if you have a current certificate, of course, like with the MDR, you could use it in this 2022-2024 transitional period. But a lot of companies think that you can just go sit on your hands then, which is not true. Because like the MDR, the IVDR also has this provision that you cannot do significant changes in that period, and you still have to implement basically all the big new items for your quality system anyway. Companies forget about that, which is still a major exercise. And sometimes it's such a major exercise that you might as well go to the IVDR anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and we discussed also about that in a previous podcast where we said also the fact that it will be the first time for some of the manufacturers that were under IVDD that they are seeing a notified body, because before they were not. So it's also something that they have to learn and to understand what are the requirements and how they have to go through an audit. So yeah, so start now. I'm not making any money. I'm saying that.
Budget for it, very important too. That's also. I see a lot of medium-sized companies in the IVD world that have like a sizable number of assays and tests, and they have no idea how to group them. For example, for conformity assessment application, and also what it costs and how long it takes. If you count back from the date of application, if you want to have an IVDR certification at the date of application, for example, because you're planning a new test close to, let's say, May 2022, that takes a long time. You have to calculate for a year at least, because there's just a few notified bodies notified yet at this moment.
No, I think it's completely clear. So I hope they will listen to us. You can contact consultant, you can contact me, you can contact all the others. So it's not like we are not making that specifically for me, but don't hesitate. Contact somebody, work on it, move forward. The important thing for our side is really that you are compliant and that we are not selling you anything here. So don't worry for that. Okay, so thank you, Eric. Thank you for all the information that we are providing. As I said, we'll try to provide more information about IVDR in the next sessions of the podcast. And if you are listening to that on your on the podcast, so while you are doing your workout or you are cooking anything, so don't hesitate to go to your application, so Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, just to provide a small review, just to say that you liked it. And if you looked at that on YouTube channel, so
very much.
Also to make a like. Yes, Eric?
I like them very much. They're excellent podcasts. I listen to them during my commute on my bicycle.
Yeah, I was doing that also on podcast. So I was listening to that on my car while I was commuting from work. But now, as I'm working for me, so I have no more commute to do for that. So. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Then thank you, Eric, and I wish you a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.